intelligencesquared.com.
Because our first speaker against the motion is William Dalrymple, travel writer and historian much award-winning, who's lived in Delhi for 25 years. His latest book, 9 Lives in Search of the Sacred in Modern India. So, William.
Suhail has been very much trying to have his cake and eat it, to talk as if he's on our side while avoiding the obvious purport of the motion that if you don't have democracy, what do you have? You have the only option other than a democracy is a tyranny. This year, as we've seen, all over the world, people have been fighting and dying and being tortured and being gunned down in Tahrir Square, protesting in Burma to fight for democracy. To have democracy and to picket it, to have the luxury of saying that this great form of governance, which has preserved you from the horrors which have encompassed almost all your neighbors, whether we're talking about, just go around your neighbors to see the other options on offer. Look at Pakistan. Pakistan, without democracy, Pakistan is interesting because it's somewhere that has both had democracy of a form and which has rejected it. But would you prefer instead the efficient rule of General Zia with his public floggings? Would you like the rule of Musharraf with his jihadi nurseries? Or perhaps we might go to Burma for an example of the alternatives to democracy. Burma, an interesting example, because again, linked under the Raj, a kind of adjunct to British India, and yet if you look at what's happened since 1962, since the military coup in Burma, unbelievable horrors, forced labor, human trafficking, child labor, massive kidnapping of women as sex slaves for the military. All things which, for all the flaws, all the little things which have damaged democracy in India, have nonetheless not even begun to happen there. Look at Sri Lanka. Since 1956, under Mrs. Bandaranaike, the Tamils were oppressed, where democracy is subverted, where the minority is oppressed by the majority, in a subverted form of democracy, you end up with insurgencies. Look what's happened to the Sri Lankan Tamils, culminating in the horrors of the camps 2 years ago. People lined up against the barbed wire, massacres, mass rapes. Look at Nepal. There again, thanks to huge effort, thanks to mass protests, people finally get rid of the monarchy, but only at huge cost to themselves. I think there's no better argument for the essential value of democracy in India than to look within India at the places where democracy has been subverted and to see what's happened. During the 1970s, under Mrs. Gandhi, a whole variety of democratically elected state governments were sacked. And the result was an incredible spread of insurgencies across the country. Almost all the major insurgencies, with the single exception of the Nagas, date back to the time when Mrs. Gandhi was subverting democratically elected state governments. The bottom line is that it is completely impossible to rule as diverse a country as India, a multi-ethnic, multilingual country, except by consensus. India's remained intact as a country because it's a democracy, and it's remained a democracy because it's so diverse. Far from endangering democracy, India's pluralism makes democracy essential, particularly the inbuilt flexibility of the federal system, which has allowed regional aspirations, allowed, for example, the Tamils to govern themselves and not behave like the Tamils in Sri Lanka who've risen up violently. It's allowed the Indian state room to breathe. Many in India look at China, at its 10 or 11% growth, at the smoothness of Chinese growth, and look lovingly at it and compare that to India and say, but for these crooked politicians, but for our terrible democratic government, we could be like the Chinese, we could have 11% rule. But of course, the much closer approximation to what India would be like if it was not democratic is Pakistan. No one would hold up that model of libertarianism as an alternative that we'd really like to follow. China also is the great exception among autocracies. Most nations that do not have democracies, the vast mass of Africa and Arabia, lag behind the democratic world in education, wealth creation, literacy. I agree with Sahel that there's no doubt that Indian democracy is an eccentric thing. In the last election, 33 of the Bihar State Assembly MPs had criminal records. The Dullar Chand Yadav, who's a very splendid character, who has 100 cases of robbery against him and 50 murder cases pending, can also be addressed as the honourable member for Bar. If you look at the last Prime Minister, but two, Vajpayee, there was a fantastic profile of him by Alex Perry of Time, which pointed out what no one in the Indian media had pointed out, which is that, I'll quote from it, he takes a 3-hour snooze every afternoon on doctor's orders and is given to interminable silences, indecipherable ramblings, and not infrequently falling asleep at meetings. He forgets names, even of long-time colleagues like his foreign minister, Jaswant Singh. And during several recent meetings, he appeared confused and inattentive. After meeting a Western foreign minister, his appearance was described by one attending diplomat as half dead. So India is not a democracy like other democracies. It is very flawed. But there is no alternative. For a country like India, with this long tradition of argumentativeness, with a tradition of diversity, multi-ethnic, multilingual, it can't be compared to China with its single Han mass, its one language, its one script. There are, of course, many minorities, the Uyghurs and the Tibetans, if you count them as within China in any legal sense. But the Han Chinese dominate to such an extent, you can't use it as a model. Even in early centuries BCs, when the first Buddhist monks came to convert the Chinese from India to Buddhism, the Chinese took huge exception to the fact that the Indians were always arguing and were encouraging dissension with the government. Even that long ago, the Chinese put a huge premium on obedience to authority. India is not like that. India is a country where everyone has an opinion. Everyone wants to have their view. Every single regional area wants representation. Everyone wants to be part, have their views heard. If any system other than democracy were used, it would be chaotic. Kashmir is the final and greatest argument for democracy if you look what happened when democracy was suspended. In Kashmir, under Mrs. Gandhi, there was a serial rigging of elections. Many Kashmiris came to believe they were not being treated as an equal part of the Indian Union, that they were a mere appendage. Following the very shameless rigging, very open rigging of the 1987 local election, the Kashmiri opposition went underground. Soon afterwards, bombings, strikes, assassinations, and stone throwings began. It is, of course, now the most disaffected state in India, a people policed by 1 million soldiers and a running sore on the Indian body politic. None of this needed to happen. Had democracy been allowed to follow its natural course, had an opposition party been allowed to rule in Kashmir, the militants would never have gained a serious toehold, as they've done nowhere else. As it was, 70,000 Kashmiris have now been killed in this conflict, and many more scarred and wounded. The reality is that democracy is not India's Achilles heel, it is India's proudest boast, and rightly so. It's the largest democracy in the world and an extremely successful one for all its eccentricities and flaws. India massively rejected autocracy during the emergency, and in 1977 threw out Mrs. Gandhi and demanded an alternative. You should not let these two persuade you that they were in any way wrong to do so.
Thank you, William. Well, a couple of minutes to my colleagues on my right. Patrick.
So, William, you've spoken about indefinable ramblings. You've spoken about the serial rigging of elections. We've learnt from Bridget that you've spent the past 25 years living in Delhi.
Not entirely true. I spent...
But the question I'd like to put to you is, have you met many politicians during that period of 25 years?
I don't spend a lot of time hanging out with politicians, but I count Mani as a great friend. And during my first phase, I was a young foreign correspondent. I met a few.
And would you say that many of them have lived up to the high ideals of the founding fathers of the Indian nation in 1947?
No, I'd say the opposite. I'd say that Indian politicians, by and large, are an incredibly unimpressive lot. That, with the exception of my honourable colleague here, who I'm sure would agree with me in many ways, that the standard of the debates in the Lok Sabha are not what he was used to in his Trinity debating society many years ago. But I think, again, this is missing the point. The flaws of Indian democracy are immediately apparent. There are a million things wrong with the MPs, with the dynastic politics, with the corruption. But there is no alternative. And in an odd sort of way, it works. When it really matters, the Indian people can throw out the governments that they don't like. They can throw out the politicians who fail them. Suhail.
Okay, so
I'll buy you a second glass of Guinness because you've just actually demolished yourself. The topic of this debate is democracy is India's Achilles heel. We haven't been invited here to suggest an alternate form of government. So let me demolish some of the things you've said. Number one, you've said India is full or largely full of corrupt politicians. You mentioned Indira Gandhi, who was an autocrat. So she installed the emergency in 1975, got thrown out in 1977, and hey, what? Because we have a great democracy. She was re-elected in 1980. And it was a victory for democracy. Please applaud. Then we have Narendra Modi, the chief minister who presided over the massacre of many Muslims in Gujarat.
Who you recently spoke up in your Facebook page, Suhail, as a great hero.
No, hear me out.
And you said Narendra Modi for Prime Minister of India 2 weeks ago,
I didn't say that.
As I remember.
This is the problem with history writers who attempt to tell the truth. My question to you is, would you want the average man, not the man who lives in a farmhouse on a foreign correspondent or an acclaimed author's salary, do you actually believe the common man gets the benefits of democracy as they should be delivered? And if not, then the system is flawed and it is an inherently weak system which needs to be corrected.
Okay, let's give William a chance to answer.
Well,
briefly,
between a farmhouse in Meroli and your grand Panchil Park apartments, it's hard to choose, but you certainly have nicer panelling in your drawing room than I do. But and as I said, your fondness for Narendra Modi and your support of him as the Prime Minister, despite his massacre.
I didn't say Prime Minister. Never.
You said on your Facebook page he was a splendid chap. You've just come back from Gujarat.
Someone else's Facebook page.
How wonderful the development in Gujarat was. Anyway.
William, to the point.
Neither Mani nor I are arguing that India's democracy is unflawed. Patently, it is flawed. Patently, there are many things going wrong. But the thing to do is not to say that democracy is at fault. It is to try and improve the democracy. It seems to me that I'm not a kind of democratic fundamentalist. I don't believe, as President Bush believed, that democracy in itself is automatically a solution to all problems. What I think is the case is that corrupt and unrepresentative and flawed democracies without strong independent institutions like a free press, an independent judiciary, an empowered election commission can produce governance which is every bit as tyrannical as a tyranny. But the reality is that democracy has in its makeup, in its DNA, the ability to keep restoring itself, every time there is an election, you have the chance of throwing out the MPs who fail you. You have the chance of throwing out discredited, corrupt politicians, if that's what you want to do. And so it is a self-restoring system. And I think it's getting better. I think if you look at the way that the Indian governance is going, India is getting there. As we all know, it was slower on the uptake than China in healthcare, in providing literacy to the masses. But the masses are crying out for it. They are big. I mean, the turnout in Indian elections is some of the highest in the world. They participate in the democratic process for the very good reason that they know it can change their lives. So when people are dying for democracy elsewhere in the world, even as a debating point, to stand and say that democracy is a weakness is like the luxury of a spoiled child. You're sitting there in the state, which is one of the rare states in the region, which has got this fantastic system of governance, when all around the chaos and tyranny. And I don't think you realize quite what a gift you've got.
Thank you. Thank you, William Dalrymple.